clearly the crisis that is in place in terms of the conflict between Iran and Israel is at real risk of spilling over and broadening and all control of it being lost. So it is so important that we reiterate today very strongly our calls for de-escalation, diplomacy and dialogue, and the positive role that I think Europe can play in relation to that. Because remember, actually the only talks that have taken place with Iran in recent times have been with Europe through Kaja Kallas and the German, French and UK foreign ministers last Friday. We need to get back to that level of engagement here. When I spoke to the Iranian minister yesterday, I really urged that Iran would come back to a negotiation position. And we did remark this morning at the breakfast, and I think this is an important point to remember, that while we've seen in the past, the nuclear deal with Iran and the likes that was imperfect, it certainly yielded much more in terms of any level of military aggression. And ultimately, the only way forward in relation to this situation will be a diplomatic, negotiated solution. Nobody in the European Union wants to see Iran with a nuclear weapon. But we know the way to best keep people safe in the world, to best ensure that never happens in relation to Iran, is through a negotiated settlement. Of course, when all of this is going on between Iran and Israel, the horrific genocide in Gaza is continuing. Children in Gaza are still starving, and the humanitarian situation has worsened, not improved, since the Foreign Affairs Council last met. I welcome the fact that finally, there was a review of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. It's very clear from that review that Israel is in breach of its human rights obligations under Article 2. And it's not good enough just to say somebody's in breach and it's a consequence-free zone. If a review finds a breach, consequences must flow from that. And the rationale for consequences is this: it's to try and change behaviour. It is to use every lever at our disposal to make the horrific actions in Gaza stop. And I look forward today to hearing the High Representative's comments in relation to the review, but then making the point, as I will make on behalf of Ireland, that this has to be followed by a series of proposals in the days and weeks ahead of specific actions, sanctions, consequences that the EU can impose on Israel.
Your Spanish counterpart said that the association agreement should be suspended immediately. Do you think you would agree with that assessment?
That is the view of Ireland, and we very clearly said that ourselves in recent weeks as well, but that there's not going to be a consensus in relation to that. So what we have to do, I think, is work on what can be achieved here. And I want to see the European Union in the first instance recognise that a review has now taken place, that the review is clear in its findings, and then I want the Commission to get on with the job of coming back to ministers or leaders in relation to proposals for action to be taken. If you have an agreement, and an agreement has human rights obligations, if the people you have the agreement with breach those obligations, there have to be consequences. If not, what is the point of having the human rights obligations in the agreement? So this is about the credibility of the European Union when it does agreements. It's about saying to our citizens, our words matter. It's about saying to our citizens that when we enter agreements and put the human rights clauses in, it's not for padding, they're not discretionary, they're not nice to have, they're compulsory, mandatory parts of agreements when we do business with people, and there have to be consequences. And like I say, the consequences aren't about punishment, the consequences are about trying to change behaviour, trying to use every lever at our disposal to end the genocidal activity that we're seeing in Gaza.
Do you support full or partial suspension?
Personally, I believe the agreement should be suspended. There is not, in full, there won't be a consensus for that. That would require unanimity. So what my focus on today is twofold. Firstly, getting a recognition today, the first time, an actual formal recognition that a review has taken place and that Israel is in breach of its Article 2 obligations. And then secondly, an instruction to go to the European Commission to now work on proposals to be considered in terms of what consequences, actions or sanctions flow from that.
Donesh, just on the Iranian or the US strikes on Iran, I mean, is that something that you would condemn, this escalation from Trump's administration?
I thought, just because you brought it up, I thought the Irish Times commentary in relation to that, in relation to the position of myself and the Taoiseach on that yesterday, to maybe have missed a couple of things that we actually said. So, I mean, I've been very clear in relation to international law around attacks on nuclear installations. There are international laws that say you shouldn't do that. I'm also very clear, and I said very clearly yesterday, that actually the actions of the United States added a significant level of danger to an already volatile situation. So it was a very unhelpful intervention. While there will be, I'm sure, different views and different perspectives, the reality is this: the only way, I believe, to make progress in relation to this, to stop an already tinderbox type situation getting even worse, is to get back to a negotiated situation. What has happened has now happened. It has added a huge layer of extra volatility and danger, but what we now need to see is no further escalatory measures, and that really has to be where the focus of the European Union has to be, and using every bit of influence we can use individually and collectively by continuing to engage constantly with counterparts in the region and with the United States to try and make sure there's no further escalatory actions.
With the US tied up in this war now, do you think it takes some of the oxygen away from trade talks, and how close do you think the EU and US are to standing down this kind of tariff war that's looming?
Well, it's very helpful to remind us of this, because you're right, with so much going on in the world, so much danger in the world, and the very, very dangerous situation between Iran and Israel, it's also true to say that within a matter of days, within a matter of 2 weeks really, the deadline in terms of the current pause on tariffs will expire, and therefore it's really important that there is intense work between the EU and the US to get to, at the very least, a framework agreement by the 8th, 9th of July. I spoke to Jemison Greer just over a week ago. I spoke to Maros Sefcovic last week, and I did take from both of those engagements that there are now significant talks underway, both at a technical level and at a Commission trade representative level as well. I think these talks are going to be challenging for a number of reasons. I think they're going to be challenging because it seems to be the US position that 10% is nearly the new baseline, and for some sectors of the Irish economy and for some sectors of the European economy, that poses real challenge. When I did speak to Jemison Greer, he did make the point to me that the 10% is the new baseline, except where there can kind of be 0 for 0 arrangements reached. And I think the European Commission and Maros Sefcovic are quite right to be ambitious in terms of suggesting many sectors where we'd like to introduce 0 for 0 tariffs. I think the other point from an Irish, but not just an Irish perspective, because it affects around 10 EU member states in a very real way, is the issue of pharma. And when I did speak to Ambassador Greer, I specifically asked him about the pharma sector. I thought there was a recognition that the EU and the US are much more interdependent on pharma than perhaps had been alluded to in the early days of the rhetoric around trade. And I think both the ambassador and myself alluded to the wish for creative solutions to be found, where we can actually work more closely together on pharma, because I think the impacts, not just to any one economy, but actually the impacts to patients, to supply chains, and indeed the impacts to effectively shrinking US pharma companies in terms of their own footprint, I think would be quite foolish. So I'm very hopeful that we can try and find a constructive, creative way forward on pharma. But you're right, this trade and tariffs hasn't gone away against the backdrop of all the dangerous military and conflict situations we see.
Thomas, just on Gaza, is it disappointing that there's still a block of 8 or 10 states that seem resistant to do anything, voted against there being a review in the first place? What would your message be to them in the room today?
Well, look, I'm trying to focus, I suppose, on what we can get done, and I suppose we've gone from Ireland and Spain on our own saying we think there should be a review of the association agreement to a clear majority of member states basically mandating that there would be one. I welcome that. There are always different nuances or focuses in the European Union. However, the European Union is, and I often make this point, I made this point this morning to colleagues, is actually united on many things. We all believe in a two-state solution. We all believe in wanting humanitarian aid to flow, the hostages released. We all want to see the conflict end. We want to see a ceasefire. But there are some of us who believe much more must be done to make those conditions a reality. And what I want to try and focus on today is, firstly, is it possible that for the very first time the European Union will say Israel is clearly in breach of its human rights Article 2 obligations under the association agreement, step 1. And if that is the case, what now consequences will flow, step 2. And that has to be where the focus of the work needs to be today. Of course, at a domestic level, Ireland will move ahead tomorrow. I will bring the heads of a bill to Cabinet in relation to our own legislation to ban trade with the occupied Palestinian territories. As you know, in the first instance, that draft legislation will talk about goods. Very clear, just to get ahead of anybody who thinks I'm not clear on this, very open to considering the issue of services, but do need to have legal clarity as to whether that's possible or not, and I've asked the Attorney General in relation to that. But we will bring draft legislation because we're not waiting in Ireland. We're not waiting. The children of Gaza have waited far too long. I'm a big fan of the European Union. I think Europe has been the greatest peace project ever. I'm really, really a big fan of Europe. Very proud that we're core members of the European Union. But our response in relation to Gaza has been much too slow, and far too many people have been left to die as genocide has been carried out. So I'm hoping we can finally make some progress today.
Okay, quick domestic one.
Sure.
It's a favour for a colleague at home. Tax breaks for developers, yes or no?
Well, of course, none of these questions are that straightforward, but I did read the Sunday Business Post, as I do every weekend. I read it at the weekend, and I obviously heard the fact that those who are responsible for building many houses actually suggested there were other practical steps that could be more impactful. When I talk to people who are in the industry, and indeed when I talk to many people who just want a home in Ireland in what is a housing emergency, I think the most important thing is that we get the viability measures right. There's a range of ways you can make construction more viable, particularly apartments more viable. I think we've taken some of those steps already, providing clarity and certainty around the RPZs, the planning permission extensions, the exempted development changes we're going to make. I think the next big move we need to make on viability will be next month in the National Development Plan, where we will look at how we can better fund and faster delivery around water, wastewater. These are some of the big blocks. So, look, we look at viability all of the time. I remain to be convinced that tax is the most effective tool, but there are definitely more measures we need to take on viability, and you expect we will in the weeks ahead.
Okay,
thanks everybody.
And Ursula von der Leyen have not said it's a violation of international law, the US strikes, and the global south is basically saying this is another double standard from the EU. They've invented an international law and they're not defending it today. You've condemned it, but what are your thoughts on this kind of discussion?
Well, I think it's always very interesting, everybody accusing Europe of having double standards. Europe has standards. And actually, often those accusing Europe of having double standards don't show many themselves. Europe has standards. We're rooted as a European Union in human rights and in international law. And I thought about President von der Leyen and High Representative Callas's comments yesterday by clearly talking about international law. Both of them referenced the importance of international law. Both of them referenced absolutely the European view that Iran should never have nuclear weapons. And it is Europe actively trying to find a diplomatic way in relation to this. So I'm much more focused on the actions that are being taken rather than parsing the individual words. Thanks very much.
Thank you.